Around the world, there are over 50 million people fleeing hunger, war, and persecution. That's more refugees than at any time since the end of the Second World War. Many of those who make it to Germany are turned away, overwhelmed by red tape, or repatriated by the authorities. The Church of the Holy Cross in Berlin offers them hope, helps overcome the language barriers, and in desperate cases gives them asylum in the church.
The legal framework for church asylum has changed dramatically in the past 20 or 30 years. But the reasons have stayed the same: severe humanitarian crises, psychological and other illnesses, or the physical dangers of returning to the refugee's country of origin. But it's simply unacceptable for Germany to say that they all have to go back to Italy because that's where they entered the European Union. So that's given rise to resistance and criticism. And that's why there are more cases of church asylum.
Pastor Jürgen Quandt has been helping refugees for the past 30 years. Here he's chairing a discussion between refugees and politicians in Berlin's Church of the Holy Cross.
I believe there are some people here who have something to say on that subject.
I say no. The agreement says you can stay in Berlin. Alle bringen ihre document.
The refugees' representatives want a just consideration of their asylum applications and say if they were allowed to work, they would make a contribution to German society.
I think that proves what we would lose if we were not able to keep these people in our city.
Italy is the first port of call for many refugees heading for Germany. But EU law says they can only apply for asylum in the first EU country they reach.
Together with church, we have more power. We have power. So, church, please, we need your support more. And anyone.
Most of these refugees are Muslims. Their plight touches the hearts of the Christian congregation, and they are moved to help.
The concept of church asylum is based on certain convictions, which in my case come from the Christian faith. But it's also a very human response to ask yourself what you can do to help when you see people around you in a desperate situation. The fact that, in my case, I have focused on refugees was not planned. It simply developed out of the direction that my life took.
Jürgen Quandt and his wife live in the former caretaker's house on the edge of a cemetery. He became pastor of the Church of the Holy Cross in the late 1970s and got involved in social work.
I was an active Christian in my youth, and after I finished school, I had to think about what I wanted to study. Our pastor was a very gentle man. One day he asked me if I'd like to study theology. Well, of course, my faith was important to me. I already had an idea of what it meant to me, its importance in my life, and what it could mean in relating to other people. I wanted to provide help for people who needed help.
Jürgen Quandt is now retired, but he's still very active. Just a few meters from his front door lies the grave of Cemal Altun. The young Turk's death was the trigger for Quandt's commitment to the victims of persecution.
Cemal Altun, who's buried here, was a young man from Turkey. He sought refuge in Germany, refuge from persecution.
Jamal Altoun fled from the military dictatorship in his country. He was a democracy activist, and the military junta that seized power in Ankara in 1980 viewed him as a traitor. There is no doubt that Altoun was a political refugee, but the Berlin authorities locked him up like a dangerous criminal for 13 months in solitary confinement.
Some people approached our parish and asked if they could use our premises to stage a hunger strike to protest against this young man's detention. And we said yes. It was in the spring of 1983. That was when we started looking into the situation of refugees, and especially the question of political asylum. But the story of Jamal Altoun ended tragically.
Terrified that he would be deported to Turkey, Altoun jumped from a window of the courtroom during his hearing and died immediately. Thousands of sympathizers attended his funeral. It was conducted jointly by an imam and Jürgen Quandt. The death of Jamal Altoun was a turning point in Pastor Kvant's life.
Jamal Altoun's fate is a reminder of what it means to be a refugee and to be buried in a foreign country. Most refugees don't even get a proper grave. When their bodies are washed up on the island of Lampedusa, they're also buried in foreign soil. Yet they left their homes in search of a better future. No refugee leaves his home voluntarily.
The first thing refugees need is shelter.
Hello, Pete, are you at home? How are you?
Jürgen Quandt housed refugees in empty administrative buildings at Protestant cemeteries. This is where Pete lives. He's from Cameroon, where ethnic minorities are marginalized, oppressed and persecuted, and often jailed without trial. Pete was tortured, and he was traumatized when he arrived in Germany. He's still frightened of his persecutors and wants to remain anonymous.
I should visit you because I got a letter from Christa, which she had written to the Zentrum für Folteropfer, you know?
Yeah.
And there she asked for help for you, that you can go there. Have you been there? And are you also...
Pete is receiving therapy in a center for victims of torture. The church also organizes language courses.
I'm learning German.
He's learning quickly. At home, he spoke several dialects.
Wonderful.
Great. You keep getting better. You can also see a happy child in the picture?
Okay. Bye-bye, Pete. Goodbye.
Although Pete is learning German fast, he is often alone. He looks forward to the pastor's regular visits.
For him, a pastor is someone to look up to. But the reality is just the opposite. I should look up to him. He feels flattered that a person he views as an authority has taken an interest in his well-being.
I
do what I can, but I can't do it all on my own. I need the support of other people. I hope that together we'll manage to resolve his situation eventually.
The Church of the Holy Cross first offered asylum to refugees 30 years ago, shortly after Jamal Altoun's death. Political activists contacted Pastor Quandt and asked him to help a group of Palestinian refugees. The families had been living in Berlin for some time. Now they were due to be deported to war-torn Lebanon. They included the Hamoudi family, who the pastor is now visiting.
We hadn't actually planned to offer them asylum in the church, but the first refugee families were brought to the parish center, along with several mattresses. The activist rang the doorbell and said, "These people urgently need shelter, otherwise they're going to be deported." I had no opportunity to verify the claim. I could either say, "Okay, come inside," or "Go away." I decided to let them in, and that had tremendous consequences.
Jürgen Quandt has kept in touch with those first asylum seekers he sheltered in his church.
My decision was momentous because it introduced the first church asylum in modern times, without actually knowing what was involved. For the parish, it meant that for several weeks, the parish center was occupied by 3 families with lots of children. And we had to decide how to manage the situation.
The church provided the Hamoudis with accommodation and legal advice. Instead of being deported to a war zone, they were able to return to their Berlin apartment. And they're still in Germany, 30 years later. During their weeks of church asylum, they forged friendships that have endured over the years.
What's important is that we could help and that we've stayed in touch.
Mr. Hamoudi still appreciates the pastor's commitment.
He really helped us. He did so much. He fought for us. So many people were taken to the airport and sent back. He stopped the bus and took everybody off in front of the police.
By stopping buses and saving refugees from being deported, the pastor and his helpers drew public attention. German society became more sensitive to the plight of refugees.
That was the beginning of Asylum in the Church. And lots of parishes, first in Berlin and then across the whole of West Germany, joined the movement. They provided church asylum to prevent refugees from being deported to countries where their lives were in danger. And of course that led to discussion in the parishes, in the churches, and among politicians, and that discussion is still continuing.
The headquarters of Asylum in the Church is at the Church of the Holy Cross. Pastor Quandt was co-founder of the association and, until recently, its chairman. The main focus is to provide independent legal advice. The association is funded entirely with donations, and almost all of the staff are voluntary workers.
Guten Tag. Tag, Katharina. Hallo, guten Tag. Tag, Elisabeth.
Applying for asylum in Germany is complicated. Refugees are foreigners who don't know the legal requirements or even how to apply for asylum.
Wiedersehen.
Jürgen Quandt comes to the office frequently to ask about the refugees' application status and discuss the possibilities of concrete assistance.
Does she have family here?
Yes, she has children. They have permission to stay and are now applying for citizenship.
It's not just legal advice. People come here with their problems. And speaking as a pastor and a theologian, I would say that it's a tremendous pastoral and human challenge to bear the pain and give them hope and courage.
The current chairman of Asylum in the Church, Pastor Bernhard Fricke, meets Dede from Nigeria, who has been living in Germany as a so-called tolerated refugee. Now he's facing repatriation and fears for his life.
Na? Prost. Prost. Alles in Ordnung?
Ja, Gott sei Dank.
Du hast eine Ausweisung, ne?
Ja, die Ausweisung, ja.
Dede's toleration status has been rescinded because he was drug dealing. He went to jail and was then put on a plane headed for Nigeria. He would rather die than return home and face torture, so he took tablets. A doctor stopped his deportation. Now he faces repatriation again.
Wenn das nicht klappt, dann müssen wir uns was anderes ausdenken.
Asylum in the Church has made a film about the Nigerian's fate to promote understanding of his situation.
People call me Dede. In my language, that means brother. I've lived in Germany for 21 years. We had to shoot.
As a young soldier, Dede refused to shoot unarmed civilians. As a result, a woman and her children were shot by others.
She took a few steps. The woman and the children were dead.
Because he refused to shoot, Dede was tortured and faced death, but he managed to escape. His situation was precarious. Dede never wanted to leave Nigeria, but he had no choice. So he came to Germany, a country he trusted.
Refugees are not globetrotters. When they leave their country in desperation, or they're expelled, you can easily imagine how completely disoriented and helpless they are in a strange environment. They're dependent on strangers. And the new world that they enter is often bureaucratic, hostile, and restrictive. To find their feet is not just incredibly difficult. For many, it's impossible.
To help people like Dede, many more parishes are needed to provide asylum and assistance. Jürgen Quandt visits Pastor Dieter Schulze in Joachimsthal, a short distance from Berlin. Quandt explains the government's refugee policy and emphasizes how important the work of Asylum in the Church is.
Right now, Jordan, Iraq, and Turkey are accepting hundreds of thousands of Syrian refugees. And we argue about taking in 5,000. And we don't even allow the Syrian families already living here to take in their refugee relatives at their own expense. The reason is that our politicians are afraid that their approval ratings will fall.
An increasing number of refugees are being refused asylum in Germany. Many of them protest against the unwelcoming policy. They occupy public places, including churches. Jürgen Quandt understands their anger and fears that Europe will isolate itself even more. That, he says, is no solution.
The inner structure of an isolationist society will always become more restrictive because refugees will continue to arrive, and you have to deal with that pressure. It's simply there. And this has an effect on society. I believe that everything we've slowly built up in this society over nearly 60 years, since 1945, will be lost. Certain democratic forms and a certain culture, compassion and a willingness to accept responsibility for others, and much, much more. Democracy itself will suffer.
Jürgen Quandt is making another trip to Joachimsthal. The church there has started helping refugees. 2 men from Somalia, who fled their country years ago, are due to be deported immediately. The association Asylum and the Church has reviewed the men's situation and sees no possibility other than playing for time. The society's lawyers will fight for a review of their applications.
Na, Klausita, dann bin ich schon wieder da. Ja. Gar nicht so lange her. Grüß dich. Grüß dich. Alles gut bei euch?
Ja, alles gut bei euch. This is Sharif.
I am Jürgen.
This is Hassan.
Hello, Hassan.
Jürgen Quandt knows the 2 Somalian refugees are at least temporarily safe here.
So we here.
Where do you come from?
From Somalia.
From Somalia, and you?
I'm from Somalia.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. And where have you been before?
Oh, Slovakia.
Slovakia.
Yeah.
Slovakia. Oh, yeah.
Hassan has had a long journey.
Ukraine.
Before arriving in Germany, he was in Austria, Slovakia, Ukraine, Moscow, and Ethiopia. 7 places in 3.5 years.
Und alles zusammen 3,5 Jahre.
May I ask you, what have you done in Somalia?
Somalia.
What was your profession there?
I was a businessman.
Businessman, yeah. Okay. And why did you flee?
Weil die Braut vom falschen
Sharif's
Stamm
only
war.
transgression was that he fell in love with a woman from another village. They wanted to marry, but neither his own clan nor that of the bride would accept that. His relatives threatened to kill him. His only choice was to go to Europe or stay and be killed. And so he fled to Holland, where he lived on the streets for 7 years. Now he wants to stay in Germany. The 2 Somalians met in a German refugee camp. Now they're being cared for by Asylum and the Church. They were forced to flee their homeland in haste. Hassan left his wife and children behind.
This is your family.
I have 5 children.
Boys or girls?
Alles young.
Alles Jungs. His name is?
Abdikafi.
Abdikafi.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
This
That's
is your...
Abdurrahman.
Abdurrahman. Would you take your family from Somalia to Germany? Is it your wish?
Indeed, it's his fervent wish to be reunited with his family. He's worried about his wife and 5 children. They keep in contact by email, and his wife sent him these pictures.
Yeah.
His youngest son only knows his father from photos. Hassan says he had to leave his family because he was unjustly accused of spying for the enemy. He was condemned to death, but managed to escape from jail. Both men are trying to learn German as quickly as possible.
Also, dann die Frage. Wie spät ist es?
15 Uhr.
15 Uhr, genau. 15 Uhr, ja. Great, wunderbar, hervorragend. Genau, was lernt ihr noch?
The 2 refugees would not receive such a warm welcome everywhere in Germany.
I feel my life is starting now when I come to Germany. Before 7 years, I was going down. Now I'm going up.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Because I hope so. When you hope something, it's good, and when you don't hope anything, it's different. So I feel it's hope now.
Oh, danke. Ich finde das ganz toll, also wie sich...
I think it's really great, the way the 2 of them, Sharif and Hassan, have found their feet so quickly. I think it shows that Church Asylum also helps to integrate newcomers. This success proves it. Between 70 and 80% of all church asylums end well. Or at least they create opportunities for the refugee. Maybe not a permanent situation, but at least a temporary opportunity. And I think that's a lot.
The concept of church asylum is not covered by German law. These Christians simply act because they see a desperate need.